Hello, I'm Nicholas Henshaw. I'm the Vicar of St Thomas's here in Groombridge, and this is part of our Lent course, although of course it's open to everybody. You're very welcome. And we're looking at the New Testament, and today it's a whistle-stop tour of Matthew's Gospel. And let remind you, I mean, I've said this again and again, this isn't about learning more so that our heads can be fuller, but loving more so that our hearts can be fuller. As we go deeper with the Jesus we know in the Gospels, then we begin to go deeper with God in prayer, deeper with God in the way we live our lives. So, Matthew's Gospel. We're going to call this Gospel Matthew because that's the name associated with this Gospel since the 2nd century. But of course, we don't know because none of the Gospels are signed by their authors. None of them tell us who wrote them. Although the Apostle Matthew may have founded the church from which the Gospel originated, certainly we can say that the author has a great command of Greek, a really decent theological outlook, and almost certainly a rabbinic training. He straddles that big fault line in the early church of Jew and Christian. Remember, almost all the early Christians had first been Jews. It's a big issue in Paul. How do we reconcile that? So he's writing in a context probably very urban, probably wealthy. Many of the people would suggest it's Antioch in Syria. He's certainly writing after the destruction of the temple. He makes it very clear in chapter 22, verse 7, that the temple has been destroyed, and we know that happened around 70 AD. So for Matthew, that's something that's happened in the past, so we can date this to after 70 AD. So he's in a rich city, a Greek-speaking city, a place with a large population of Jews and Gentiles. We know that from all sorts of things in his Gospel. Now, Matthew, as we know, contains everything, pretty much, that's in Mark, and normally in the same order and in the same wording, and has strong overlap with Luke, in a different order and with different wording. And of course, there's material unique to each of them, which may be quite interesting. Now, whereas we saw with Mark's Gospel's really structured in two parts, like with two bits of wood, really. So I know where I'm going with that, with a hinge in the middle, and the hinge is the Transfiguration. Now, Matthew's Gospel is structured differently. Matthew's Gospel is structured really in three parts. The first is all his birth narratives through to Jesus' baptism and temptation. The second part is the public ministry of Jesus, healing, teaching, coming up with Israel's repudiation of him, the conflicts with the religious elite. And the third part is, of course, Jesus' journey to Jerusalem and his suffering, death, and resurrection. Now, the way Matthew shapes his whole Gospel is it starts, if you like, at the very, very beginning with Abraham in chapter 1. That's part of the genealogy. So he roots the very origins of Jesus in Abraham, and Matthew ends his Gospel with the end of the world, so to speak. Not the end of the world, but the end of the age. I'll be with you for always. So in a sense, Matthew's biography of Jesus is shaped around this clear central message that at the very beginning they shall call him Emmanuel, which is God is with us, and at the very end, I am with you always to the end of the age. That sense of the whole narrative and for all time, for before all time and forever is the purpose of what Matthew is speaking about. The message is that Jesus has drawn near to us, to be with us always. God is uniquely present in the person and work of Jesus. And in becoming Jesus' disciples, we become children of God, citizens of his kingdom, which is known as the kingdom of the heavens in Matthew. That's quite Hebraic, very Jewish. And in response, we are sent out to the ends of the earth as his messengers to what? To do what? To instruct or to make disciples of all nations? Well, here's a question. I mean, if you go back in terms of translations of the last part of Matthew's Gospel, the last few verses, up until about the 1950s, all translations said, go instruct the nations. And that's the King James Version too. And then sometime during the 20th century, it became go make disciples of all the nations. I'm afraid I'm with the earlier version, very strongly so. I think we've made a technical thing out of discipleship. We have discipleship training. No, that's not what the New Testament talks about. No, not at all. Disciple just means learner. What would happen if we just translated the word disciple every time it occurs in the New Testament as a learner? Learners in the kingdom of God. That's who we are. It's not a technical phrase for an education program that we've got to go to every Wednesday night in our local church. And the job is not to disciple people. That's not what Matthew's Gospel is about. It's to instruct, to help people learn about Jesus. That's a different thing, it would seem to me, a different thing. Learners in the kingdom of God, and therefore ones who go out to the ends of the earth to share that good news. So what about the character of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel? Now, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John are, of course, the same gospel message. I must emphasise that. The good news of Jesus Christ. But because they're different people in different contexts, talking to different communities, they see Jesus in different ways. And because we're different people, that's really helpful. I suspect each one of us, even if we might not admit it, sees the portrait of Jesus in a different gospel as the one we really get. That can really help us. It helps us to see more truth about Jesus, more good news. And that's why I want to look at the character of Jesus in each of the four Gospels now. That'll inform, I hope, the rest of this Lent course too. If the character of Jesus in Mark, as we've seen, is proclaimer, announcer, herald of the kingdom, no nonsense stuff. And if in Luke it's Jesus, the friend of our frailty, and we'll see that in a later video. And if in John, more difficult to sum up in a one-liner, I promise, it is Jesus as God, who therefore does the works of God. So what about the character of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel? What becomes very clear soon on in Matthew's Gospel is that Jesus is a teacher. Matthew talks about this more than any other of the Gospels. So in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus' role as teacher is right up front. Again, I don't want to teach grandmothers to suck eggs, but in Matthew, Jesus has 5 great blocks of teaching. Now, if we're assuming, as I think we have to because it's written into the text, that Matthew is writing to a mixed audience of Jews and Gentiles, that makes complete sense. He himself has this rabbinic background as far as we can see, and so he's communicating something extraordinary. 5 books, 5 blocks of teaching, 5 books of Moses, what we call the Pentateuch, the book of the law. Matthew's saying something quite bold there. These 5 blocks of teaching represent the new law of God, inaugurated by Jesus. Now, Matthew helps us notice, he especially draws our attention to these 5 blocks of teaching because he specifically has the same phrase at the end of each one, not found anywhere else. And that phrase is, "And so it was that when Jesus had finished." Now, that may not sound big in English terms, but it's like a signpost in the Greek. Jesus has been teaching, pay attention. Jesus has been teaching, pay attention. And unless we're really missing the point, Matthew is suggesting that just as there were 5 books of Torah made of the Old Covenant, so yes, 5 blocks of teaching. I mean, it's. I hope that's straightforward. And of course, Matthew's Gospel, like the others, is full of healing miracles, parables and signs. But again and again, it is Jesus' role as teacher that stands out. It's easy to misunderstand these 5 great passages of teaching in Matthew. They've often been called sermons. But they're never called that in the Gospel. In many languages, the first block of teaching is known as the Sermon on the Mount. I'm sure I've used that phrase myself. But the word sermon doesn't occur in Matthew chapter 5. It is on a hill, okay. But the real reason Jesus goes up to preach, or to speak rather, on the hill is not to preach an open-air sermon, but to teach his disciples. The Sermon on the Mount is not to a great crowd, not to the people. It's discipleship training. Oh no, I've used that phrase. It's forming his disciples so they can be bearers of the good news. So let's look quickly at these 5 blocks of teaching because they're fundamental to how the gospel works. So Matthew 5 to 7. That's the biggest, longest and most famous of the passages of teaching in Matthew's Gospel, beginning with the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn. These extraordinary, a beautiful poem about what it means to be a citizen of the kingdom of God. Training his disciples, not the crowd in general, how to be salt of the earth, how to be light for the world. He's teaching them to go beyond the written law, a big theme in Matthew's Gospel, that yes, the law is fundamental, but Jesus wants to push people beyond that boundary to the law of love, to pray simply and with sincerity, not to judge, not to be hypocrites, to aim at real holiness and to build our lives on rock. It's powerful stuff. Read it today in one go and ask what Jesus is saying to you. I think it's a great thing. That's Matthew 5, 6 and 7. So the second block, Matthew 10, Short but powerful would be the summary. It comes just after Jesus has chosen the 12 apostles and sent them out. That's what apostles do. The word just means sent out. Sent them out to preach the gospel. So this short set of instructions is instructions for how apostles should behave. What are they to do? They're to proclaim the kingdom of God in word and action, to be prepared for persecution and not to worry when it comes. So read Matthew 10 for training in how to be an apostle. Matthew 13, slightly different, as it is teaching through a series of parables and stories, partly heard by the crowds and partly spoken to the disciples in private. The parable of the sower, the weeds among the wheat, the mustard seed, yeast in dough, treasure in a hidden field, the pearl of great price, a great catch of fish. Then Jesus asks the disciples, Do you understand all this? And of course they say, yes, we do. These are all parables of the kingdom. Jesus is telling us what the kingdom of God is like and asking us if we understand the cost of discipleship. And one point I just want to make, which I'll make fully probably somewhere else as well, is all those parables are not kind of just static images. They're actually all dynamic. The kingdom of God is like a man digging a hole to find a pearl of great price and selling everything he has in order to have that pearl. You know, they're exciting. They're whole stories in one sentence and sometimes one word. Yeah, but parables asking if we understand the cost of discipleship, what it's going to cost us, not financially, but in laying down our lives that we may save them. Matthew 18 comes after the Transfiguration, which remember is the central point in Mark's Gospel, not so much in Matthew's. The disciples come to Jesus and ask a very stupid question. Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Maybe it didn't sound stupid to them, but to us we know this is a stupid question. Jesus immediately responds by placing a child in the centre and said, be like a child. That leads into practical rules about how to behave in Christian community, ending with the parable of the unjust steward. Really dark parable, showing what happens when we behave badly. And then the fifth passage, the fifth part of teaching of Jesus' teaching in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew 24 to 25. Quite amazing. Some of it's really scary. The final piece comes during the week leading up to Jesus' death, what we call Holy Week. Jesus is teaching his disciples privately on the Mount of Olives, very close, very couple of miles from Jerusalem. He talks about the importance of enduring to the end, of staying awake, of staying faithful, like the parable of the wise virgins, which he tells at that point, and ending with the extraordinary parable of the Last Judgment, where Jesus states clearly, and he's addressing here the whole world, all the nations, he says, will be gathered. His point is the examination at the end of time will be in love and service. It's amazing. It's very powerful. It's not what the medieval church made of heaven and hell. So a very distinctive feature of Matthew's biography of Jesus is the depiction of Jesus as teacher. And that is not just in the 5 blocks of teaching, but at other crucial points in the gospel, above all at the very end. I've said this already, about the translation. Yes, it's not go make disciples of all the nations. That's not what Jesus says. Disciple is not a technical term at this point. He says go and instruct all the nations. Tell them about Jesus. Now, go back to the very beginning of Matthew's Gospel. The genealogy in Matthew, and remember the genealogy in Matthew, the kind of birth narrative is different in Matthew and Luke. Each of them have a different family tree. The family tree in Matthew, which we won't go into in too much detail, read it in your own time, but has 4 women in it. And that's important, something very interesting. There are 4 names of women, or references to women, and all the rest are men. Why does Matthew do this? Well, it's been debated over the centuries why Matthew does this, and there are all sorts of different versions. So this is mine, but it's got some good backup in theological thinking. So 4 women are included in the genealogy in Matthew at the beginning. And all of them have a history, which we are meant to know about. That's one of the difficult things for us, isn't it? That it doesn't matter how deep we are in this stuff, that we live in a culture that's illiterate about the Bible. And that means things that in the first century, everybody would have understood. Oh, that's so-and-so. Oh, of course, that comes from X. We don't get that very easily. That's not a criticism. We're all swimming in that sea. But these 4 women are all important in different ways. I rather like it. What one writer calls them God's 4 unlikely grandmothers, or Jesus's 4 unlikely grandmothers. And they're worth spending some time with. The first to occur in the genealogy is Ruth. Ruth is mentioned in verse 5 of the genealogy. Now, Ruth, remember the little book of Ruth? Now, in the Christian version of the Old Testament, we place that among the history books. It's a nice story about a lady who's faithful to her mother-in-law. In the Jewish Bible, it's not there at all. It's in the wisdom literature, where it's a radical story challenging some very, very Puritan theology in the the period after Babylon. So Ruth's quite a radical figure. Now, the important thing about Ruth is she's a Moabitess, i.e. not a Hebrew, not a Jew. She is a wanderer's widow. That's very important. She's not a Jew. She's kind of a stranger, but she is, as everybody would know when they heard this, the direct ancestor of King David. Oh dear. In the Old Testament and for Jews today, you are a Jew because your mother was a Jew, not because your father was a Jew. And of course, oh dear, Ruth's mother wasn't a Jew. So she's not a proper Jew. Oh, well, so David, King David's granny, so to speak, and ancestor of Jesus, was not a proper Jew. So if you're a Puritan and think you've got to be in that direct lineage, then, oh dear, there's something going wrong. Then David is not a proper Jew, etc., etc., etc. I think by including that name, Jesus is saying something really important. He's saying Jesus is for everybody. Don't try and shut this down. Don't say it's just a particular bloodline, a particular group of people. You've got to be a Jew or this is for everybody. And I think that's very important to Matthew's gospel. That to quote Paul, the dividing wall has been broken down. The second name is Tamar. She crops up in Genesis 38. Really tragic. She disguises herself as a prostitute and sleeps with her father-in-law and has twins. So she's a very irregular person. What's she doing in the genealogy of the Lord of the universe? Oh, well, she's telling us something very important, that some of our posh narratives actually don't quite fit the truth of the birth of Jesus. The third is Rahab, who is a prostitute. This is in Joshua chapter 2, the book of Joshua, quite a rough read, I can tell you. But Rahab is extraordinary. She saves the lives of the Jewish spies, the Hebrew spies, who've been sent to spy out the land. Rahab turns her life around, joins Israel, and has a son by an Israelite man. So that's a story of an irregular person, not exactly being regularized, but actually being grafted on into the family. And then Bathsheba. Oh dear, poor Bathsheba. I really feel for her. Bathsheba is the wife of Uriah the Hittite. King David, the great king, oh yeah, great king, has Uriah killed and then has an adulterous affair, because he's had an adulterous affair with Bathsheba. So David, yeah, great king, but adulterer, murderer, war criminal. I mean, it's very dark, the Old Testament. But these are the narratives that lie behind the New Testament. 2 Samuel 11 is where you find that story. So yeah, there are competing theories about the significance of the women, but I've always gone with the obvious one, that these are all improper people. They're somehow tainted, but therefore in the upside down valleys of the kingdom of God, these are precisely the people whom God would choose. The point which Luke takes up with great gusto, as we'll see when we come to Luke's gospel, is that Mary is just such a person. Matthew has a slightly different take on the virginity of Mary from Luke, but for both of them is the long Old Testament understanding that virginity is always a bad thing, always a negative. So of course a virgin, the wrong kind of person, is exactly the person whom God would choose, just like Ruth and Bathsheba and Rahab and Tamar. So something very radical is going on here, that actually Jesus is the kind of the wrong kind of people, and Mary is just the wrong kind of person for God to choose. I don't want to go too much about the way in which Matthew uses Mark's material, but it's worth noting that what Matthew tends to do, he uses Mark's material and has a slightly more positive spin on most things. So he organises it a bit better than Mark managed to do. He abbreviates things that are irrelevant to Matthew's context and don't make sense in his context. And because he writes much better Greek than Mark, then he tends to smarten things up a bit. And he uses his language well. I mean, this is good Greek. He likes accuracy. So where Mark just says King Herod, Matthew says Herod the Tetrarch, which is actually the right proper phrase, and so forth. And whereas in Mark's Gospel, Mark tends to to try and explain Jewish customs, and it's clear Mark doesn't really know, or Mark's community doesn't really know about Jewish customs. Matthew's community, of course, does. So they don't need all those explanations. In the same way, Matthew has a different gloss on the character portrayal, not just of Jesus but of others. So questions that might imply a lack of knowledge in Jesus in Mark's gospel, he just misses out. And statements that suggest a lack of ability or authority on Jesus' part are again just missed out. References to Jesus' emotions are dropped. That's quite interesting. Mark uses very emotional words. There's a wonderful word, splanchnizthis, which means Jesus felt it in his bowels. Matthew doesn't like that stuff. We don't go near that. Another word that Mark uses a couple of times, and John uses as well, is Jesus snorted like a horse. And Matthew mixes that, doesn't like that at all. That's not, emotions don't do this. He misses out words like pity, anger, sadness, wonder, indignation, love. Those are Mark words, not Matthew words. And the disciples, again, in Mark, the disciples are described quite rudely, to be honest, and particularly Peter. And I love the idea that Peter was the source of that. It's a very negative portrait of the disciples, but Matthew glosses that again. So, for instance, where John and James go to Jesus and say, "Can we sit on your right and your left in your kingdom?" Well, in Matthew's gospel, they don't do that. Their mother does it for them, which seems to me, a bit naughty of Matthew, frankly. In the same way, the religious leaders, a scribe whom Jesus praises in Mark becomes in Matthew an opponent who tests him. And friendly religious leaders such as Jairus and Joseph of Arimathea don't really appear as religious leaders in Matthew. So there's a kind of softening of criticism, if that's the right way of putting it. And of course, there are lots of literary features of Matthew's gospel, as we'd expect of a more accomplished writer than we find in Mark. And therefore, a general, well, you can understand. I'm not saying that Matthew's the second written gospel, but certainly he's later than Mark. That it's very clear that Mark was, the one when it was first written and distributed all over the place. But as soon as Matthew's gospel comes along, people tend to abandon Mark. So we have very few manuscripts of Mark's gospel after Matthew's comes along. It's also the case, and this is a bit warped, I'm afraid, because it's very obviously not the case, that certainly by the High Middle Ages and even before, the church came to the conclusion that Matthew's gospel must have been first because it has more in it. No, we know that's the other way round. Mark's gospel is first because it's the most condensed of them all. And of course that led to all sorts of misunderstandings. So in the Western church, Matthew's gospel became the kind of this is right in terms of its narrative and its time structure. In the Eastern church, and we'll see this in a couple of weeks' time, they said no, John's gospel is right in its narrative and its time structure. Of course, John has a very different time structure from Matthew, Mark, or Luke. And therefore, as we'll see, we've got to make a choice. I'd have to say that over the last 1,500 years, that the West chose Matthew and the East chose John has meant lots of differences, even down to the dating of the crucifixion that we still live with. But I think that's great. It's not a problem. I actually think it's really important that we recognise, as Cardinal Newman used to say, theology is always a process of saying and unsaying. And having four Gospels confronts us with this glorious reality that these are texts in conversation. Texts in conversation, not a conversation that happened 2,000 years ago, but is happening in the church down the centuries, and we are part of that conversation now. So that's Matthew's Gospel. Matthew, a teaching gospel, Jesus as teacher, Jesus as one whose entire salvation history spreads from Abraham to the end of the age, and his promise that he comes to us, yes, in the child Emmanuel, and be with us forever until the end of the age. And he invites us, or rather we are invited by the gospel writers to join in that conversation today. So do join in any way you find useful. If you've got questions, ideas and suggestions for more in this series, then do so, and do join us. The next instalment will be Luke's Gospel, and we'll say a little bit about the Acts of the Apostles in there as well. But do ask me questions, do send them email in any way you can, and I'm very happy to clarify ideas and points and so forth. And of course, I'm not right about everything. This is just me sort of riffing around the Gospels, trying to go deeper with this extraordinary God become a human being in Jesus Christ, who has called me to be his followers, who has called us to be his followers, to be people of good news, in all the challenges of the world, to know that he is Lord of all.